Any system only operates through a specific set of rules, guidelines, and parameters. What we endeavour to achieve from a system is results that are both prescriptive and expected. Systems are not generally designed to include the element of human emotions, and as such, the clinical operating structure is tested in ways we cannot often foresee. When emotion and grief subside, most of us look to rely upon structures that provide us hope and possibility. This is the vacuum where victims of crime can find themselves left wanting. Wanting for the potential of gaining some sort of empathetic understanding at its least, and at its most optimistic, well-measured justice. How are we expected to respond when our systems seem to fail our idea of justice, or at least continue to baffle us, clouding the concept of what we believe they were created for in the first place? As the judicial landscape again continues to terraform around those left behind to grieve, we attempt to make sense of all that comes next in the story of the Hillier Triple Murder, here on the next episode of Just Lawful.
Adelaide is the perfect place to set a horror story. You know why all those films and books are always set in sleepy conservative towns? Because sleepy conservative towns are where those things happen. Exorcism, omens, shining, poltergeists. Adelaide is Amityville, or Salem, and things here go bump in the night.
Welcome back again to Just Lawful, where things do indeed go bump in the night. My name is Daniel Panozzo, and I'm again, of course, joined by my co-host Sean Fuster. A huge thank you to everyone listening, and if you haven't heard the previous episodes of this series, we strongly recommend going to iTunes or Spotify, rating us, subscribing, and then catching up on where we left this story and where we're up to now with the Hillier Triple Murder. Before we begin, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander listeners are advised that the following program contains the names and references of people who have died. If you find anything we've discussed over these episodes distressing, please make use of the following support resources: the Victim Support Service on 8231 5626 or 1800 182 368, the Domestic Violence Crisis Service on 1300 782 200, the Domestic Violence Gateway Service on 1800 800 098, or the National Sexual Assault, Domestic and Family Violence Counselling Service on 1800-RESPECT. Sean, when we last spoke about this case, we had just finally gotten to court and heard the sentence given to Stephen Graham Pete, where he received 30 years for the murders of Yvette, Amber and Corey. Now, I want to take you back to one statement you made right at the end of that. We were expecting a new record sentence to be given to this man, and we didn't get that.
That's right. We were all sitting there thinking, and it was a fair comparison. The previous triple murder in South Australian history is the Kapunda Triple Murder.
And that's certainly a case at some point is going to come up time and time again, and we may even look at that down the track.
That's right.
Certainly another comparative case, as you say.
Comparative, yes, but also comparative, no. The Rowe family, 2 adults and a teenager. The Rigneys, 1 adult, 2 children under the age of 10.
Yeah.
How do you do the mental mathematics, the judicial calculations that say that the lives of a single mum and 2 defenceless children under the age of 10 are worth less than the lives of 2 grown adults and a teenager? Now, I'm not comparing here in the sense that some of you may be thinking, but just think about the way we sentence crimes.
Yeah.
The younger a victim, the more abhorrent, surely it's got to be.
You would think so, Sean, and I know exactly what you're saying. And for those people out there, we are merely comparing the idea that, look, 3 lives were taken on both sides of that, right? And as you say, adults and a teenager versus an adult and 2 very young, under the age of 10, defenceless children, there's got to be some sort of merit given to the weight of how that all plays out.
And unfortunately here, the merit was given in a different way. Now let's break this down, because this was the sentence of Justice Malcolm Blue of the Supreme Court. He said the murders were incomprehensible and they were reprehensible. He praised the families who gave those moving victim impact statements that we heard on our previous episode, saying it was profound listening to them. He said, "There is no excuse for your deplorable conduct toward Yvette. She was only 28 when you took away her life." He said, "It's obviously very difficult for anyone to comprehend how a person in your position could kill a 6-year-old girl and a 5-year-old boy in the manner that you did. Your killing them was a senseless and incomprehensible act." Now, that's everything you want to hear. That's everything we've been saying, episode after episode after episode. But here's the rub. He also said that while the experts had concluded Pete was not in a dissociative state, he felt Pete may have experienced some disassociation during the crime, and said, "I'm satisfied on the balance of probabilities that you were experiencing a degree of disassociation when you killed the children. However, that did not prevent you from forming an intention to commit what was clearly an extremely reprehensible act." Now that's opened the door. You'll remember I said way back when automatonism, when disassociation was first raised, as defense counsel, you're trying to open a door for mitigation. And if you can't mitigate the entire crime away, you want to reduce the sentence for your client as much as possible. Well, it worked, because Justice Blue discounted the sentence on the grounds of that potential dissociation on the balance of probabilities, not beyond reasonable doubt, but on the balance of probabilities, and went one step further. He said that even though Pete's guilty pleas came in a burst, and then a long gap, and then another burst, even though Pete had lied to psychologists in order to create that extended period of time, even though, as he pointed out, and we learned for the very first time, Pete had a prior history of violent offending, including an incident in 2008 when he beat a hospital patient with a fire extinguisher, telling police afterwards his intention was to kill the patient, who survived. Even with all that, including that new information, he said, "Your guilty pleas are still worth a 10% sentencing discount."
Sean, I'm going to have to jump in here because I'm sure I'm not the only person. And look, I have no doubt that there's people at home right now screaming at whatever device they're using to listen to us, saying, "What are you talking about? How on earth is this man drew any discount under any circumstance whatsoever?" Especially when you now say we've got uncovered yet more information of a violent criminal past where he admitted to an intent to actually take someone else's life. As you said, look, I understand to a degree, and I want to get you to weigh in a little bit here in a moment. There are discounts given as sentences for those who plead early. I get that. So if you actually front up, own up and say, "Yes, I did it. I am guilty of that crime," there is a discount given to that. Now, I understand that's going to open another conversation sidebar that we could go off on a tangent, and one day we will. Right now is not the time. Whether you believe there should be discounts to sentences or not is irrelevant right now. This sits in place.
It's a fact. It's a system.
You can get a discount, granted. But as you said, this man lied. He gave multiple different versions of this, retracted his own admission multiple times, laid blame on other people, made up this state of mental incapacitation, had this automaton concept thrown out there, has delayed this process over and over and over for nearly the best part of a year, 2 years here, and we're still going to give him 10% discount.
That's right, because eventually he copped to it all. It's one of the most frustrating aspects of the entire sentencing process. The sentencing discount regime was brought in to speed up the court process. The court process was very log-jammed from decades of backlog. Speed it up, get the cases through.
Get that.
It's supposed to be a sign of contrition.
Sure.
You plead guilty early because you know you did it. Because you know you did it, you're already on your way to rehabilitation. Explain to me how a man that does everything that you've just listed on that laundry list of horror is anywhere near rehabilitation.
Sean, I can't help you with that point, and I know that was a rhetorical question you're throwing at me. I totally get that. There is no way for me to attempt to try and talk to you about justifying that idea, because there is no justification for me in that. That, to me, is if it's upfront, you cop to it early, you save us all this process. He hasn't saved us that time through the court process. He hasn't saved that undue hardship to everyone else that's had to go through that. And I'm talking about, obviously, the families, the friends, all of that. But you're also talking about the state. You're talking about the judicial system. You're talking about lawyers, judges, all those people who've had to put man hours into this ongoing. Not to doubt that the professionals and the who have come in to check whether he is or isn't mentally capable. All of these people have had extended exposure to have to do this because of his lies, and yet we're still going to offer him a 10% discount.
He's not expedited anything.
No.
He's exacerbated everything.
That is my point. And yet, that is the complete converse of what this idea of a discount was supposed to be in place for.
And that was the feeling that I had at the time, that I'm sure the prosecution had at the time, and I know that Steve Egberts, the grandfather of Amber and Corey, had. And I know this because Steve didn't wait. The moment that sentencing discount was announced, and the moment that Pete was sentenced to a life sentence with a 30-year non-parole period for 3 murders, Steve stood up and walked out.
I'm going to touch on that in just a moment, Sean, because there's a couple of points. I want to understand the response from the family and the reaction and how that must have been, because, look, no amount is going to bring anyone back. We know that. That cannot have felt justified. And the other side I want to understand, because we started off, I asked you at the start, we were expecting a record sentence, we didn't get it. I want to understand how that relates to what the other triple murder we're talking about before, what that number was, and what the reactions were in a moment. Sean, I just wanted to touch with you, as I said, you mentioned we were going to get a record. There was another triple murder.
We thought we were going to get a record. This is the thing.
Okay.
You can't ever predict what a judge is going to do. You look at precedent. You look at what's come before, and you say, okay, how does that compare to this? To go back to Kapunda for a minute, and to expand on that a little bit further. Chantel was a teenager.
Mm-hmm.
Andrew and Rose were adults.
Yes.
They were asleep in their bed. Chantel was asleep in her bed.
Yep.
Downey, who was psychopathically obsessed with Chantel, broke in and slaughtered all 3 of them.
Yeah.
One of the worst crime scenes that's ever been witnessed in South Australia.
Yep.
He deservedly was jailed for life with a 35-year non-parole period. And because he's Scottish-born, whenever he does achieve parole, he will be deported out of the country straight away. That's a massive sentence.
Absolutely.
Deservedly massive sentence. Everyone had been thinking 2 adults and 1 child equals 35 years in the eyes of the court.
Yep.
Therefore, 1 adult and 2 children has to be more than 35 because of the age of the victims involved.
Definitely.
Because of all those calculations that judges tell us that they have to do, all of the precedents.
And because of that, and I'll go back a step, and I apologise. We weren't steadfastly demanding. We had, as you said, the expectation that we were very likely going to see a new record set here.
That's right.
And yet we didn't.
And just as Blue even said, he would have originally sentenced Pete to life with 33 years.
Right.
And then discounted it by 10% to get down to 30 years. So even his starting point, as they call it, was beneath the Kapunda triple murder.
And I think that's a part that really is a little bit baffling.
And
Right.
I'm still baffled to this day. There isn't an explanation beyond what's in the sentencing remarks. And as we've talked to you before, listeners, you can go to Ostley and read the sentencing remarks. They're there. There's no mention of this in the sentencing remarks.
Yeah, right.
It's simply, this is what His Honour felt was appropriate.
Okay.
Now, Steve, as I said, Steve Egberts, stood up and left.
And that was my other point. That's what I wanted to get to as well. I wanted to touch base on where that fell in regard to the Kapunda situation. However, you said Steve left.
Yeah, I wanted to touch base with Steve and
Of
find out
course.
how he felt. Steve was gone.
Yeah, right.
For the second, maybe third time in this process, I didn't see Steve for dust.
Okay.
He left. Janet, his partner, the children's grandmother, she left in tears as well.
Yeah, right.
Donna Rigney was distraught.
Yep.
She left upset. Everyone was livid. That's the word. There was no getting sense out of anybody. Sometimes as a journalist in these situations, you know discretion is the better part of valor. Step back. Don't even try.
Of course.
Now, the TV stations do. They stick microphones in people's faces. They follow them down the street. They walk backwards with their cameras. I don't believe in that. So I just stood back and let it happen. I gave Steve a call, left him a message and said, when you're ready, let's talk.
Yep.
I didn't hear back from him for a couple of days.
Sure.
When I did, though, this whole thing took another turn that I didn't expect.
How so?
It started off, I don't want to say fairly standard, but it started off in the ballpark that I expected it to. Steve's reaction to the sentence. And let me tell you what he said to me. He said, we're bewildered by the gulf between community expectation and judicial sentencing. We're utterly devastated by the 30-year non-parole period. And we feel like the voice of the victim is not heard in the court process. He said, the voices of our beloved grandkids and their mum were ignored in favour of Pete. Listening to Justice Blue empathise with Pete's dysfunction absolutely broke us. I am bewildered at the disparity of opinions between the public and the legal system. There's a sign there of how deep the gulf is between what the community thinks and what judges think.
Yeah.
He said, in our opinion, victims need to be represented by an independent lawyer that informs them of how the process works and only has the victim's interests at heart. Now keep in mind, Steve and the DPP had already crossed swords by this point. Remember, we don't deal with this in the media. We don't speak to victims through the media. Here's Steve reaching out again, saying that to me. Janet took the phone and she spoke to me as well. She said, the sentencing made me feel physically sick. I think murder sentences should be based on what the victims have suffered and the severity of the crime, not by the excuses a perpetrator gives for their actions. You can really understand where they're coming from because whether it was over and above the Kapunda sentence or not, Pete is serving less prison time than a judge automatically thought he should because of the excuses he gave and the pleas he entered at bizarre times that do not correspond with the concept of contrition.
Yeah. I think for me, a couple of points there were the words community expectation as opposed to what actually transpired in reality. That to me is a really big call out, and I think there'd be a lot of people listening right now that would be going, absolutely, there's a huge gulf, as you mentioned, between what that expectation is and what we see play out. And that's why we do this show, Sean, because there's clearly that discomparative sort of idea or understanding of how we get from one to the other.
And let me get on my soapbox for a minute. There are people in the legal profession, both sides, prosecution and defence, who will tell you no sentence is ever enough for a victim. You could hang them from the middle of Victoria Square and they'd still be calling for their toenails to be pulled out first. Victims don't have a proper understanding of how it works. Listen again to what Steve said. It's about the gulf in community expectation.
Yep.
Steve is not speaking as a bereaved grandfather alone.
No.
He's also saying, my bereavement is the tip of a spear.
Yeah.
And the spear is the rest of the community, the full length of the spear behind him, saying, this is not right. This is not what we expect. So every time I hear a prosecutor or a defense counsel say, you can't trust what victims say about sentencing, you all need to listen to what victims say about sentencing because you're only hearing what you want to hear. You're dismissing them. You're minimizing them. You're pushing them to one side because, they're the highly emotional people that our logical world has to deal with. No, they're the tip of the spear, and you need to start listening.
It's very easy to hear the message you want when you lock yourself in an echo chamber, isn't it, Sean?
Especially when you're wearing a sheepskin on your head or horsehair. But look, I said this took an unexpected turn.
It did.
And it did because I mentioned to Steve during this conversation the argument that I heard. Remember I told you about that argument?
You mentioned that. Well, you went to court, you overheard this argument. Janet was outside, visibly upset, and you didn't necessarily get a chance to talk to Steve about that situation.
And Steve didn't give a victim impact statement as a result that day.
Yeah, that's right.
And when he did give a victim impact statement, it was on behalf of his son,
Correct.
the
That's
father of the children, not himself. I said to him, hey, why did you never give a victim impact statement? And what was that argument all about? Steve took a long breath and he said, well, it's because I was subjected to an inexcusable personal attack by a prosecutor. I said, I beg your pardon? He said, yeah, I've filed a formal complaint with the DPP's office.
So this is the thing with this case for me, Sean. This is another aside to the horrific, horrendous, horrible situation we had happen in that farmhouse. Is one thing, right? We get that. And all the stuff that we've had to go through to get through understanding all of that gruesomeness of what that was, the actual court process, Pete finally admitting to all this. This is a side to all this that we don't even know is going on at the same time. So this is the part of this case for me that just starts, it goes out and twists into that unforeseen labyrinth of all these other elements that come into it.
And it sparked another newspaper story. Now, let me read to you what I wrote at the time, because this is the best way of getting this across. The grandfather of the children slain at Hillier has filed a formal complaint against a state prosecutor who, he says, subjected him to an inexcusable personal attack during the killer's trial. Steve Egbert says he was personally attacked outside the Supreme Court in January, just minutes after triple murderer Stephen Graham Pete finally confessed to his crimes. He claims a senior prosecutor sought to blame him for the 5-month delay in the case, took credit for the conviction, and told Mr. Egberts, "Don't whinge in your victim impact statement."
Sorry, so this poor grandfather of these slain children has been told that this member of the legal fraternity is taking credit for getting this conviction, and then almost backhandedly telling him that when you do speak about this, don't whinge.
Don't whinge. Steve said, "I was ripped into outside of court on the worst of all days, and I will never forgive them for that. I was dragged down in my worst possible moment. It was so insulting as to be beyond belief. I was the victim of a personal attack." Now, this is what he wrote in the actual formal complaint.
Sure.
"I was the victim of a personal attack. The prosecutor claimed my participation in the trial was detrimental and the reason for such a lengthy trial. He further commented I would now be able to whinge to everybody in my victim impact statement and that only his hard work resulted in the desired outcome." Steve went on to say, "While I appreciate the hard work put in by many, this person is not one of them. He appears to be somewhat vengeful after our disgust of prior treatment was published in the Advertiser. His snide attitude toward us betrays our faith in the system. To blame me for the delays in this case is unacceptable. My family and I have spent 3.5 years in this, and we still have a long way to go to recover. It's daunting." Now let me rewind something for you.
Yeah.
Remember, Adam Kimber, the then DPP, told me, "We don't deal with the victims through the media."
Yeah.
Mr. Egbert said Mr. Kimber had asked him to postpone his complaint until the end of the trial. So before any involvement by the Advertiser, trying to sort this out, trying to speak up for Steve, the DPP's office is already saying, "Just wait till the end. We'll deal with this at the end. Just hang on longer. Be dealt with by this senior prosecutor that you have made this formal complaint against. And just knuckle down and bear down until we get through to the end of this."
Sean, I'm a little, I'm going to say perplexed by the attitude of those involved. And I guess it goes back to the last few episodes we talked about, where I understand it's not the role of these people to necessarily display empathy or any of that nature. They have, we talked about it being the justice train on the tracks of going down there. And I get that that's their role. But just the concept here of a man grieving for this, having to go through a world that he's been thrust into, not wanting to, and probably having no understanding of before this moment, we can't show him a little bit of humanity and empathy in that space. I want to touch a bit further on this in a moment, and I want to go a little bit deeper. I want to understand what the fallout from that was and what that complaint sort of led to. All right, so we've now got a formal complaint lodged by the grandfather of these young children. You've written a second article which has explained this situation. You've just read out to us what that formal complaint by Steve was and the sentiment that went in that. And that's just you reading it. Again, it's just you reading it. I can only imagine the vitriol and the angst that must have gone into those words as he put pen to paper there. Where does this go? When you do that, where does this lead to? What's the result of this?
You won't be surprised to know that the very first thing I did was call the DPP's office for a response.
Of course, we need to validate this and check our sources, as that's called good consciousness of journalism, right?
Even though I believed Steve 100%, because after that incident with that senior member of government,
Sure.
What are you doing wasting my time at 5:55 on a Friday night with these ungrateful people?
Indeed.
I had no doubt that this had happened. No doubt whatsoever.
Yep.
But you still do the bona fides.
Of course.
You still make the call, and you get no call back.
Didn't even get a police put it in an email.
Not even that this time.
Wow.
The entire system had shut down.
Yeah, right.
There was no room at the inn. No one was about to talk to me about this after the last incident. There was no call on a tram. No off-the-record conversation. Nothing.
Wow.
I would call again and again, leave messages. No response. So Steve, to his very deep credit, spoke again. He said that it's an absolute pure insult to allow multiple murderers to serve single life sentences.
Mm-hmm.
Steve is of the opinion that the American system of multiple life service... Steve is of the opinion that the American idea, multiple life sentences for multiple murders, is the right way to go. At the very least, he objects to the concept of non-parole periods that encompass multiple people.
Sure.
As he said, homicides in Adelaide tend to be of a particularly cruel nature. This place is weird in terms of how people die. It always seems to have a cruel edge. Now, I agree with him. I wrote a book about that.
I was just about to say, if anyone, I don't know if he's read your book or not, but clearly he's seen the things and heard the things that you have.
You and I worked with Channel 9 on a TV show about that.
Absolutely.
It is a fact. Adelaide has a cruel edge. Steve is 100% right. He said, I cannot see any other answer to that than consecutive life sentences. Some people just can't be cured, can't be rehabilitated, and I'm absolutely convinced Pete is in that group. Now have a listen to this. Steve said the mandatory minimum penalty for killing one person is 20 years. That means my grandchildren's lives were worth 5 years each. Because he pleaded guilty to Yvette's murder first.
Correct.
So that's automatically 20.
Sure.
So Corey and Amber, mathematically,
Yep.
have been given 5-year allotments.
This is the part that I don't understand, because you and I have spoken about that before, and that 20 years for a murder, I'm hesitant to say I get it seems right. Okay, it is a huge chunk of time and life, and 20 years, I get that. So I'm going to throw a really elementary question out to you, Sean, and please treat it with the unintelligent sort of, and I'll say the naivety that it probably deserves. Why are we not starting at 60 years here?
Okay, so you start at 20 because the idea is that a murder that is just slightly more serious than manslaughter is worth 20 years.
Okay, but we've got 3 of these, right?
We've got 3 of these. So the idea is that you're supposed to say, well, how serious is this? How severe is it compared to other cases? Which is why we all thought we were pretty safe thinking 35 and up. Because
Right.
Hillier, 35 years was not enough prison time for Jason Alexander Downey. I want to make that very clear.
Right.
But it's what he got.
Yep.
Okay, so this has got to be at least 35, if not more.
Sure.
Because, again, we're in triple murder territory.
That's right.
The bodies in the barrels, serial killers.
Yep.
Bunting and Wagner, what people erroneously call the Snowtown murders.
Yep.
Life without parole.
Mm-hmm.
Mark Aaron Rust murdered Megumi Suzuki and Maya Jakic, raped 3 other women.
Mm-hmm.
Life without parole.
Right.
Dita Pfennig murdered Michael Black
Mm-hmm.
and Louise Bell, pedophile murderer. Life with a 60-year non-parole period.
Right.
Somehow, we're at 30 years for this. So the system does work is the point I want to make here.
Sure.
The worst of the worst are going away for the longest of the long.
Sure.
It seems to be, though, that there is this blind spot when it comes to this, what people like to call intimate violence. You know, Downey was a stalker.
Yep.
There was a power and a sex component to that.
Mm-hmm.
Pete was the boyfriend. There's a betrayal of trust and domestic violence involved in that.
Yep.
Seems to be that there's a real black hole of understanding of mathematics, of due process when
Yeah,
it comes to
I'm
those sort of crimes.
Yeah, that's the part that I think I know I am, and I'm sure there's a number of our listeners which are still scratching their heads right now going, I know what you're saying, Sean. I don't understand how that equation works.
And Steve said the same. He said, the idea that the children's lives were worth 5 years each is a massively inadequate, beyond comprehension, just tragic conclusion. It's an absolute pure insult. And to your point, he said, no rational person would think in 30 or 35 years' time that it's a good idea for men like Pete to be sharing their street with them.
Absolutely not.
You imagine? Oh, hi, I'm your new neighbour. What's your name? Steve and Pete. Really? You now live in my street? Yeah, I've done my 30 years. Don't think so, sunshine.
Yeah. I'm with you, Sean, and that's the point I'm making. I don't understand. As I said, I'm still unsure why we're not starting at 60 years, but I'm going to let that go.
The idea is, to make it one more time, that you are supposed to start at the least possible murder and work your way up. Now, our previous story about Jack Hanley makes it pretty clear that when you're talking about manslaughter, you're never going to get near 20 anyway.
No.
Because there's all sorts of loopholes and ways out of that. And, that's why these two stories have followed each other here on Just Lawful, because we're building a spectrum of understanding here.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this is where we're at.
Okay.
With a DPP that isn't interested in speaking.
So we still have no response?
No response yet.
Okay.
A little while later, a couple of weeks, possibly even a month later, I get a call from Steve. He says to me, look, I just want you to know I've dropped my formal complaint against the DPP.
Okay.
I said, really? Why have you done that? He said, I can't do this anymore, Sean. He said, I have to give up on this for the sake of my mental health. This entire trial, but specifically this part of it, has run our family into the ground.
Yeah, understandable.
So I did what I always do. I did an interview. We wrote another story. Steve said, it's been pitiful, but at the end of the day, what's happened with us is done and dusted. Still, my concern is for other victims. There are victims out there who won't feel like they can stand up and talk, and I want to see change made for them, because it's not in the public interest for prosecutors to behave that way. He said he'd spoken to Adam Kimber, then DPP, now District Court Judge, and Mr. Kimber had assured him that the prosecutor involved had been personally counselled. He said, Mr. Kimber said the prosecutor told him, quote, I can't even fathom the amount of stress Steve is under, end quote, so when he called me out it was probably stress. Steve said, if I'm expected to keep my cool and risk being ejected from court if I call the man who killed my grandkids some choice names, why isn't this prosecutor expected to be held to the same standard? Assurances of personal counselling mean nothing unless there's an actual change in behaviour. Otherwise, there's nothing to suggest he won't do it again.
Sean, I'm gonna be really, really look. I'm not even going to call it what I'm going to say, but I'm going to give you an example here. For me, that is like saying, look, this meal wasn't good. I'm really sorry about that. I'll have a word with the chef.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but that is the severity of what that sounds like to me.
It carries that much weight, doesn't it?
It really does. It's like, oh, your shop assistant was rude. I apologise for that. Please know I'll have a word to them and make sure they don't treat anyone else like this.
And it's funny that you say that. It's funny you say that because Mr. Kimber decided to speak to me after all of this.
Okay.
He issued a statement.
He issued a statement.
Yeah.
Please.
Not a conversation.
No, that's
an emailed statement.
That is why I sort of hesitated for a moment.
This case has been a very difficult one, he wrote, bearing a lifelong impact on victims that cannot be overstated. There has been very close liaison between my office and all victims throughout this matter. The overwhelming majority have included the involvement of a social worker. Many of those meetings have been very lengthy and have covered a number of exceptionally difficult topics. Given some of the publicity about this matter, it is important that I emphasise all of my staff involved in this matter have my full support.
even when they try to then say, oh, the incident that has been raised actually wasn't my fault, the person who raised that point to you, they're probably a little bit stressed by what they're going through, and that's probably what caused them to think that that wasn't a really nice circumstance.
He's just a victim. He's popped off. It's okay. It's all right. We're the lawyers here. We know what the score really is. Again, point of the spear tip. Steve's not concerned about himself anymore.
Yeah.
You've blunted that spear tip. You've bent it. You've basically shattered it. He can't fight this fight anymore. But behind him is the entire length of that spear that wants to push through, saying, you may do this again. Let's go back to Julie Kelvin.
Yeah.
Julie Kelvin heard details about Jack's death for the very first time in that courtroom. Janet and Steve and Donna heard the details of their loved one's death for the very first time in that courtroom. The Rowe family heard the details of those murders for the very first time in that courtroom. There's 3 examples off the top of my head. I could give you many more from the past 19 years. You cannot tell me that the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions in this state always acts with the best interests of the well-being and mental health of victims at heart. Sometimes, absolutely. There are good stories, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Why do I keep hearing this, though? And why do I keep hearing this in these major matters? What is it about the size of a prosecution case that means someone can't take the time to sit someone down and explain to them, this is what's going on, to let them vent, to just, as you said, show a bit of humanity? Why are we in this situation again?
Formal complaints aside, handling and the care factor or lack thereof of those people involved aside, what's next?
For all that we've criticised the DPP so far, there is one thing at which we are of a mind. That's the DPP agreed that the sentence imposed on Stephen Graham Pete was completely unacceptable.
Okay.
And so he launched an appeal. He said, this is a crime at the upper end of the scale of seriousness and therefore deserving of a high-range penalty. Jason Alexander Downey, in the Kapunda incident, had killed 3 victims in a very short period of time in a continuous frenzy. Pete, he said, was different. He told the court, unlike Downey, there was a substantial delay between Pete's first crime, which was brutal in and of itself, and the murders of the 2 very young children. In the course of that delay, he had an opportunity for reflection. He made the children breakfast, giving them toast, and allowed them to watch television. He went outside to have a cigarette, to think about what to do, and when confronted with the possibility of discovery, he chose to kill. Let's break that down for a second. Downey got 35 years for one continuous course of slaughter.
Yep.
Adam Kimber is saying, if you kill a woman, go think about it, and come back, kill 2 more people, you are a more serious version of murder.
I would have to agree with that, Sean. There is a huge element of thought put into that, conniving, trying to get through this, and now what's the next step? That is absolutely like far more than just, and not that it downplays it at all, one continual horrific slaughter of as we saw in Kapunda.
Now, here's where I'm going to surprise you yet again. I can see you're worried.
I'm not sure I'm ready for another surprise, Sean.
Well, this might be a welcome one for you and for all of our listeners, because, of course, when you file an appeal, the person who received the sentence has a chance to fight it, to say, no, my original sentence should stand, it was adequate, it was appropriate, should be left alone.
So hang on, just to clarify here, we're saying that Stephen Pete now gets to weigh in on whether he thinks this is adequate punishment.
He does.
Okay, Sean.
Bill Boko came to court and said, Your Honours, we have given our client advice, instructions were taken, and he has conceded that his 30-year prison term is insufficient.
So, hang on. So he's now saying his own sentence wasn't enough.
Pete fell on his sword. He conceded that 30 years was not sufficient for what he did, and he opened himself up to the court and said, "Please resentence me. Whatever you hand down is what I will serve."
Look, there's two parts to this. Firstly, I'm astounded that this man has finally stepped up and done anything of any sort of, I'm not going to say moral sort of advocacy, but he's actually stepped up and said, yes, I'm owning this, and actually that's not enough. That's the first part. The second part for me is, have you come across this before?
I have never seen anyone in any appeal situation say, "No, give me a bigger whack."
Well, that's what I'm thinking.
And I don't know where it came from. To this day, I don't know where that came from. Everything we know about Stephen Graham Pete to this point is hiding, conniving,
Exactly.
blaming others, blaming the victims,
Yeah.
doing everything possible to stay under the radar and get away with this. Corey and Amber died because he wanted to get away from this. And here we are at the very end, the 11th hour of the process, and now he's saying, "Geez, I'm penitent."
Well, this is the part that took me aback, and that was where I was going to hang on. So he's saying it's not enough. That's not what I anticipated even slightly. And as you're saying, that's not something that you've come across either.
No, and look, Steve and Janet didn't accept it. Their instant reaction was, what's he angling for now?
Yeah, absolutely.
What's he trying to prove now? This can't be contrition at this point. And look, I would love to give you an answer. I would like to say I've seen another psychological report that explains what was going on in his head. I would like to tell you that someone came to me and smartened me up as to what was going on. I don't know. It came out of nowhere. It caught the court off guard.
Okay.
It caught myself, everybody else involved off guard. Adam Kimber thought he had, the big uphill battle that we've talked about for a DPP appeal, the very reason that there was no appeal in the Jack Hanley case. And instead, mea culpa, do with me as you will.
I am blown away by that. As I said, I'm astounded that it's the first time this man has done anything of any credibility, I'll say.
Yeah, credibility I think is about as far as you can take it.
And that's what I mean. I was ruminating with the word morality, and that's absolutely not where I'm going. Credibility, possibly. Let's put this in perspective then. If that's the case, then what happens?
Then the Court of Criminal Appeal goes away, thinks about it, and comes back. In a unanimous decision, Chief Justice Chris Kourakis, Justice Martin Hinton, and Justice Sam Doyle wrote a single judgment. They said that the murders were brutal, cold, and lacking in humanity. The original sentencing remarks barely betray the repulsion the community feels when very young lives are taken, they wrote. A just sentence in the present case must accord due recognition to the human dignity of 3 victims.
Mm-hmm.
The younger and more innocent the child, the more the murder repulses us as a community. In very simplified terms, the Court of Criminal Appeal said that there was nothing just about the sentence imposed on Stephen Graham Pete. And then they went on. They said, the mandatory minimum non-parole period for murder under state law is, as we've discussed, 20 years. Quote, bearing in mind the yardstick that represents, we agree that the non-parole period imposed is manifestly inadequate. The murder of Yvette, viewed in isolation, may not have merited a starting point of 33 years, but the murders of Amber and Corey taken together would. That in itself indicates inadequacy. So to simplify that for you, they've said the sentence wasn't lawful either, doesn't meet the legislation and the requirements, and doesn't meet the concept of justice for the robbing of innocent young lives.
Essentially, just typifying exactly what this show's all about, that this sentence here was not just nor lawful.
That's right. And so they said, Pete, we are going to resentence you. You are jailed for life with a non-parole period of 36 years.
So 36 years. So look, they've re-sentenced. It's upped. It's marginally more than the 35 from Kapunda. However, this is 36. So how do we feel about that?
It's a difficult one because you'd like to think that it's going to be much, much, much more.
Sure.
But of course, again, we're talking about what's the value of a human life. We don't want to get into that uncomfortable place where we're comparing victims of one crime with victims of another crime.
Yeah.
We just need to acknowledge the fact that the original sentencing remarks lacked explanation, as we talked about.
Yeah.
That's been dealt with, and that this is a more heinous crime because of the youth of the victims. We've dealt with that. That's the line. It's not the best outcome anyone could hope for. I think that's typified very much in what Steve Egbert said to me afterwards. He said, this is of very little comfort. There's no dignity in this, and I don't think there's been any dignity in this for any of them. They and we have had it all taken away from us through this process. Without doubt, Pete should never be released, and I don't think there's anybody who would question that. So it's amazing that we have a legal system that can come up with this judgment. The public expects a life sentence for these absolutely cold-blooded murders. Now keep in mind, Pete will only be released after 33 years if he's been a good boy, if he's rehabilitated, if he's shown genuine contrition, remorse, made efforts to make something of himself. Otherwise, he'll be in there potentially for much longer.
Yep.
The state government also has the right to overturn decisions of appeal. We've seen that in some of the more infamous cases in South Australia. I would almost bet that Pete will be another one, that they will challenge any attempts to parole him.
Sure.
That doesn't take away Steve's point that we're still looking at 36 years for 3 murders. He said, all we ever asked was that Pete get long enough so that our other family members don't have to deal with this when Janet and I are gone. It's terrible for us to know we have to leave this burden with them at some stage, this possibility that Pete may be released. We've got all the hate in the world for Pete, but there is nothing fair about this. We made the mistake of thinking that because we lost 2 beautiful, innocent children, people would give a S word. It's heartbreaking, to have gone through not just a court process that is so debilitating at any time, not just a crime that is beyond anybody's imagining or reckoning, but the additional stress and trauma of what the system did to Steve and Janet.
Yep.
To now be at this place and know that the legacy that you're leaving behind for the rest of your family is the guy that killed our family is going to be out one day. And there's nothing more that we can do to stop that.
The interesting part here for me, and as we are once again about to wrap this up, we still haven't finished this.
No. And the reason we haven't finished this is because of that legacy. Don't forget, in all of this, there's one name that you and I have consistently not mentioned, one person whose existence we've had to let drop out of this broadcast, and that's Yvette's surviving son. Corey and Amber's older brother has been absent for all of this. That's a very important piece that we need to come back to before we can close the book on the Hillier Triple Murder, and there's one last guilty party that needs to be looked at as well.
And with that, we will pick back up next week and we'll finally conclude the Hillier Triple Murders when we will talk about who has been absent and who is still yet to come to reckoning. For all of those listening to us, we thank you so much, whether it's been on 5AA our broadcast or whether it's through the podcasts on both iTunes and Spotify. Please rate, review, leave us some feedback. 5 stars is great. We love everyone who's done that, and we couldn't thank you enough for that. As before, if anything's been distressing, please use those numbers at the front of the broadcast if you need to. Beyond that, if you want to get in contact with us or see what we're up to, you can follow us, of course, on Facebook and Instagram at Just Lawful Podcast, or you can catch us on Twitter at Just Lawful Pod. Of course, for all of Sean's work with the Advertiser and the true crime scene in Adelaide, you can follow him on Facebook and Twitter at Sean Fuster. Beyond that, we just want to say, as we finally get to start to wrap up this unbelievable case that is the Hillier Triple Murder, please remember, enjoy our work, but don't become our work. And we'll speak to you on the next episode of Just Lawful.